In a world full of socio-political issues, one man searches for intelligent conversation. From Dedham, Massachusetts, the birthplace of modern democracy, this is You Don't Have to Yell, with your host, Dan Sally.
Welcome to episode 38 of You Don't Have to Yell. Sanitized after each use for your safety. It's the bad boy of nonpartisan political podcasting here with your weekly dose of the world outside the latest dumb thing people are choosing to fight about. Now, last week, we talked with Tara Sinclair about the impact the growing federal debt could have on the U.S.'s ability to both fund our obligations and deal with future pandemics, which was the perfect intro to this week's guest. Joann Weiner, in addition to being a professor of economics at George Washington University, computer programmer, and log rolling champion, I am 100% serious about that last part, is also a renowned expert on taxes, and she was kind enough to take the time to speak with me earlier in March about our tax code and the impact it has on the economy. Now, in my hour-long conversation with Joann, I picked up one thing about the tax code, that it's less about economic growth and more about what choices we want to make for ourselves and which ones we want to leave to the government. Also, I want y'all to listen to a reference to my kids being home with fevers. I recorded this in March, and there's a little backstory I'm going to share at the end of the episode. But without further ado, Joann Weiner. Just from what I've gathered of you, you're an economist, a computer programmer. You've written for the Washington Post. Are there any other surprises you have in there, like, Bigfoot hunter or anything like that? Or
I am from Oregon. I grew up there, and I when I was a young lass, I did win a log rolling championship. My mom was my last competitor.
Okay, so. I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah, but I was born in Wisconsin, and so I have a deep connection with the heartland of the United States of America.
Okay, cool. I thought when you said Oregon, I thought for a second you were going to come out with a Bigfoot story. So
I almost did, but I've never seen Bigfoot, but I do follow the news.
Yeah, I'll have to. I won't take up time. I know I won't take up time talking about this, but in one of my past lives was in stand-up comedy, and I actually performed at a benefit for a Bigfoot museum up in Maine, and I'm kind of like, I used to be a big kind of Bigfoot geek and whatnot, and read all, just kind of keep up on it and whatever. But I will tell you, nothing turns the Bigfoot audience off more than if you tell a joke related to the possibility that Bigfoot might not exist. Like, they freeze.
Yeah. That's why I said I came close to spotting Bigfoot, but just missed apparently.
All right. Well, we'll just say just missed so you don't get the Bigfoot crowd against you.
Yeah. So my last name is, by the way, pronounced Weiner.
I looked it up, but thank you for telling me.
You did.
I scoured YouTube, and I'm like, I have to because you probably get asked that question all the time. So
Well, it's my husband's last name. I was Martin's before.
Oh, really?
But that's okay.
Well, look at you.
Yeah.
Well, so my wife took on a last name Sally, so you two should exchange notes because
I would love to.
Yeah, I think you both.
You have kids?
We do. I have 4.
Okay, Lucky you. I only have 3.
Oh, do you know what?
But I wanted the same last name as my kids. So
perfect. Okay. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, we had 2, and we wanted 3. And then we had 3, and we realized we were really cut out for 2. And then the 4th came along. So, but now they're all, I think generally once they all start using the bathroom by themselves, it gets a little easier. So, we're
and then when they start driving themselves, so you got a ways to go there.
Yeah, I've got another 4 years until my daughter, and then it's like one after the other. So we're ready. And actually, good sort of caveat as well. They are all home. Well, 3 of them are home with fevers today. So you may hear some yelling in the background. Did you go to Harvard? Is that right? Or spend some time at Harvard or no?
Both. I was a grad. I got my PhD at Harvard.
Got it.
And I lived in I was one of those, what do you call them, RAs in Kirkland House.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you never would have had a reason to go to Dedham. I can tell you that much. So
No?
no, I mean, it's fine. We have the oldest wooden frame house in North America. That's our claim to fame. And until the last episode I recorded, I thought we were the home of taxpayer-funded public schools, but it turns out we're not. So, yeah, well,
my son is a Tufts grad, and he just got back from a weekend of visiting the Jumbos. He loves it up there.
Oh yeah, nice.
Yeah.
And now, so are you in DC or are you just outside then?
I actually live in DC. We bought our house back in '92.
Okay.
And apart from that stint in Brussels, we've lived here ever since.
Yeah.
You saw from my bio, I actually went to college at Berkeley.
Yes, I saw.
Got my undergrad degree there. Way back when I thought public schools were the only way to go.
Yeah, you've changed your mind?
Well, you sort of apply all over the place. You go to the best grad school you get into.
Yeah.
I really wanted to do taxes, and at the time, the U.S. Congress was just about to do. They were in the middle of doing tax reform. This was way back in the early '80s, and the best public finance economists were up in Cambridge. So I ended up at Harvard.
Okay, so you followed the economists.
I did.
All right.
Yeah, I went up. I took the train up. I met with them at people at MIT and at Harvard, and so.
Yeah.
Voila.
All right. Well, I don't think we can blame you for that. Yeah, that actually
Good choice.
Yeah. Oh, I don't think anyone's going to knock you for choosing Harvard. Let's put it that way. So, like, I think your public university dedication can only go so far. Much like when Harvard knocks, just pick up.
I was such a snob. I wouldn't even apply to a private school.
You really? And yet,
No.
and yet they found you. They got you.
Well, I mean, for college, by grad school, I was brought.
All right, got it,
Yeah.
got it. Okay. So it's funny. So that actually kind of segues pretty nicely into one of the first things I wanted to ask you about, because I grew up in a proper Republican household. We were Massachusetts Republicans, so we're sort of like the Canadian Football League of Republicans. Not quite. Not quite the reddest, but the mantra that I was brought up with was the mantra that you were seeing in the '80s, which is less taxes means people have more money to spend, means more economic growth, and now I still live in Massachusetts, as you know, so and our economy seems to, I think, be faring maybe a little better than some states with substantially lower tax rates. So, is there any relationship between tax rates and the economy, or is that just a myth?
Well, there is a relationship. It probably depends upon who you talk to and what time period that they're talking about. It's also the type of tax as well. So overall, I don't think there is any statistical connection between the level of tax rates and economic growth. So you might see, data points that show as tax marginal rates go up, economic growth goes the other direction. But it's really hard to find something that is causal. So they might be correlated, but not causal. So I would say that that's generally not true. But you can find cases where, for example, if you were to increase the tax rate on capital income, and so capital would move out of the place where it's being taxed because it can with the push of a button. So you might find that your growth in capital income is smaller the higher capital income tax rates are.
Okay.
It's less clear when you're talking about workers because they can't move as easily. So whereas you might find people in the area where I live, the what we call the DMV, the District, Maryland, and Virginia. So if any one of those places has too high a tax rate on workers, they might easily move across the border. So we do see a lot of people who move to Virginia instead of living in DC. So there's some of that as well at the labor level. But overall, there's so much going on that all of the things that affect what affects GDP growth is generally overwhelmed by the tax impact.
Got it. And so I guess the second part of that is, I have a lot of friends who ascribe to the soak the rich form of taxation. And, one of the things they'll highlight is they'll go back to, earlier in the 20th century when the marginal tax rate was in the neighborhood of 90% or the top marginal tax rate. And so I assume then there'd be kind of no correlation there between taxation and income inequality, or am I wrong there?
Well, you said taxation and income inequality rather than taxation and growth. So way back in those Kennedy era, yes, the top marginal rate did, exceed, 90%, but the level at which it was imposed was so high that actually not very many people would have paid it. So that's something that you have to keep track of when you're talking about the top rate, is that it only applies on the marginal dollar above a certain amount. And so, but there was generally a sense, though, that those tax rates were pretty high. So, because, this was long before the Laffer curve came about. But the Laffer curve, as you know, says if you cut tax rates, if tax rates are sufficiently high, then if you cut them, you might get more revenue than otherwise. And that's the simple logic that you collect no tax revenue if the tax rate is 0, and you're probably going to collect no tax revenue if the tax rate is 100%. So somewhere in between those 2 points, you collect something.
Okay.
So if it's 100 and you go to 99, you'll collect something. Okay. But I think most people think that we're not nearly at the levels where cutting tax rates would actually increase your tax revenues, except that might have been the case back, more than 60 years ago in the early Kennedy years. So there's no way that the U.S. is going to go back to rates at those levels. But it is true that I think I'd have to double check, but I think when Ronald Reagan became president in 1981, I think the top rate might have been 70%.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading about Reagan's conversion to the Republican Party, and I could be wrong on this story, but my recollection is that he was thinking about doing another movie, and it was his accountant who told him, well, if you get paid anymore, you're actually going to make less due to the tax code. And that was one of the things that, led him down that road of again, sort of the trickle down school that he that he followed as president. And so
part of what was so great about the tax reform that happened, and it began at the Treasury Department in the early 80s with Treasury 1 and Treasury 2. And by the way, I worked at the Treasury Department in the 1990s right after I got my PhD, so I was a career person. But that was the heyday of tax reform, and it truly was a tax reform in what eventually became the Tax Reform Act of 1986, is that it did stuff like the president then didn't like, which was, if I'm going to it makes no sense for me to earn more money because so much will be taken away in taxes. Can't you find another way to pay me? And so, yes, of course, smart people did. They said, well, maybe not Ronald Reagan, but a typical employee. Well, what if we gave you a car instead of a salary? Or what if we paid for your vacation? Or what if we gave you a not tax benefit? So people started getting paid in things that were not taxable. So you can imagine how those things proliferated, because if the tax rate really is that high, if you lose 70 cents of every extra dollar you earn, you're going to say, hey, wait a second, can't I get this money some other way? Not that I'm going to stop working because I like to work, but can I get another compensation another way? So the tax code became riddled with these kinds of things. And that's where the reform came through, is that a lot of those things were taken away in exchange for cutting those marginal rates down from those really very high levels.
Okay, understood. So ultimately they were able to cut the tax rates, but they also included more in that taxation. Or
that's right. Yeah, the simple way to look at it is that they broadened the base and lowered the rates.
Okay. So maybe, jumping back to what I asked earlier about income inequality is, we have a situation now where if you look at the wealthiest people in this country, the majority of their money is either in stock effectively, or investments more or less, which are taxed at a much more favorable rate compared to income. And especially in the tech sector, you have situations where part of people's compensation is in stock. And if they hold on to it long enough, they're paying 20% on that rather than whatever their income bracket would be. Is there some merit to the argument that maybe that should be reexamined, given, or maybe that's another sort of free car, so to speak, in our tax system? Or am I off base?
You might say, okay, these. Let me just focus on the tech sector and getting its compensation in the form of stock options. So they'll allow the executive to buy shares at a certain price, and the price will be something that's probably higher than the current current price. But if the stock price goes up a lot, then they get a real big benefit, because suppose it allows them to buy it at $35 and the price goes up to 100, they really make out like bandits. One reason why companies decided to start giving stock options, because the stock price was going up so fast. That's why I'm focusing on the tech sector. So way back, and I wrote an article about this when I used to write for Tax Notes, a tax publication, and it was about stock options. And Congress thought that executives and bigwigs at these kinds of companies were making too much money. So they said, you can only pay people a certain dollar amount. I don't recall the level, but let's just say it's $1 million. You got to cap those top salaries at $1 million. Congress said, okay, we're done with that now. We're gonna deal with the income inequality by not letting companies pay people more than a certain amount. Well, obviously, they're smarter than the average bear, and they said, okay, we'll leave your salary at $1 million. You can go look at the annual reports to actually find this in here and say, but then we'll give you stock options with a certain value, and the stock options aren't taxable until they're exercised. So a good intention, and you can look, I think it's through the Clinton years, the 1990s. You can then see how salaries had been going up. They stopped, but then if you break down the executive's compensation, there's a column for salary, and then there's a column for stock options. And that second column dwarfs the first. But again, that's not taxable until they actually exercise them. So should stock options be taxed when they're issued? Probably not. But is it a form of compensation that might need to be addressed? Oh, certainly. Yeah, certainly.
So I had no idea. So now just to make sure I'm understanding this right, you're saying there was some reform done around how much you could pay executives in base salary. Is that correct? And that's when the shift from salary to equity sort of happened. Is that correct? Am I understanding you right there, or am I incorrect?
You are right. Yep. And it was an unintended consequence. The good intention of keeping salaries down, but it led to the stock options. But the real scandal with the stock options came about, and this actually was a Pulitzer Prize winning story by a Wall Street Journal reporter, finding that stock options were being backdated to have them be issued at a time when it was more favorable for the executive to have received them and exercised them. And so it wasn't mere coincidence. And that was actually the scandal of the day, but it was quickly overcome by the financial crisis, which was a much bigger scandal. Yeah. So anyway, but that was sort of the stock option story, is that it became the main form of compensation.
If we look back prior to that reform of executive compensation, and folks were just being paid in cash, is there effectively like more stock money now in executive compensation out there than actual sort of taxable income across the board? So across, from not just the tech sector, but kind of across all sectors.
Probably. I don't follow it all that closely, but since the stock market has been going up, it's a much better way to receive your compensation than in the form of wages.
Yeah. I'm not going to drive this van off in a territory that I didn't prepare you to discuss, but I'm really interested in the idea that potentially this reform that was set in the 90s to help address kind of the disparity or address wage disparity between executives and everybody else actually ended up creating this compensation structure that more or less took all that extra compensation and just put it in an asset that's taxed at a far lower rate than their regular income would have been.
Anything where you can defer the tax on your income is going to be, or if it's your income's unrealized, it's going to have a lower effective tax rate than stuff that you pay tax on right away. So you can say that labor income, you go to your job, you get a salary, what we call in the tax world the W-2 income, that is taxed basically when you earn it. But capital gains, you can hang on to them, and until you realize the capital gain, it's unearned income. And then when you finally realize it, that's when you pay the tax. So if you had a stock, actually let's just say you bought it, it's not a stock option, you actually bought it at 100, and you hang on to it for 5 years and then sell it at 1,000, you may have a $900 gain, but you've deferred all of that tax for those, let's say you held it for 10 years. So it makes the effective tax rate, even if capital gains tax rate is the same as ordinary income rate, it's effectively much lower because you haven't paid taxes as you've gone on. A lot of people have said, why do we pay capital gains as, along the way on an accrued basis to try to eliminate that distortion or that difference in taxation? But that's gets into a valuation issue.
Yeah, and it I guess like as I look at this too, obviously, I was really approaching this conversation. What is an intelligent way to look at taxation going into the next couple decades? Because obviously, we're at a situation where interest rates and tax rates are both at a historical low, and an era where the level of debt we're accruing is obviously unsustainable. And so, the big question is, what aspects of the tax code can we examine that might help us remove the need to take on debt and pay for those things as we go along? And it seems to me, as we're talking, one of the easiest or one of the biggest areas to really look at is kind of like this, is how we tax investments effectively, how we tax stock or options. Does that sound, am I hitting a double there, or no? Am I still on first base now?
Yeah, no, you're trying for a steal.
Oh, really?
I'm going to throw you out at second.
All right, let's do it.
You recall that I'm from Washington, home of the world champion national.
I absolutely. So you.
So to talk about a few of your points there. So when you said we shouldn't be taking on any more debt, well, that might be true for you and your wife and your kids. Because you don't want to feel like, I'm not going to be able to make my interest payments. What if I lose my job and I'm have to declare bankruptcy because I've got so much debt? Yes, taking on debt can be a burden for individuals who want to avoid that problem. But for the U.S. government, it's probably not a big deal, so long as our economy keeps on growing. And if you recall, way back when Piketty was his book on capital. The whole book, which was 1,000 pages, I'll admit that I didn't read it, and I go along with most people on that, but I read all the excerpts and I saw him speak, so I got it. As long as the economy is growing faster than the rate of interest, you're golden. You're okay. Because the income that you're earning, you can use to pay off your debt and you're fine. But that's why individuals worry about their debt burden, because that may be a case when their income is not going to be growing. They might lose their job. They might, have something befall them, but that debt is not going to be forgiven just because they lost their job. So one of the problems with taking on such a large amount of debt at this point for the U.S. economy is that, yes, we are growing, but the rate of growth is not as high as projected or as projected to be. And the slower we grow, the harder it is to pay our debt service. Now, we're helped by that because the Fed has managed to keep interest rates low and plans to cut them even further as the economy slows. But they can only go so low. But one reason why the U.S. deficit is not getting even bigger than it already is, it's just under $1 trillion now, which is not much as this for a $22 trillion economy, but in absolute level, it's a big amount. But a lot of the slowing in the growth of the deficit is because the rate of payment of interest is slowing down. So even though our debt is growing every year because of the deficit it adds to the debt each year, because interest rates are low, that component of the federal budget is actually not growing as fast as it might otherwise. So is that a problem? Well, yeah. But anyway, we can still take on debt. So then you say, but what about this deficit? I'm sort of nervous about it. I just don't like this idea that we are always spending more than we make. And I took a look at some of the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office. They're the official scorekeeper for the U.S. government. They estimate spending, and they get the tax estimates from the Joint Committee on Taxation. And rather remarkably, our deficit, the federal deficit now, is at something like 4.5% of GDP, of domestic income. Now that's historically high for a time when the economy is growing. It's usually around 3% or so. And so the problem, and this goes back to your point about people getting older, that are, we don't have a lot of immigrants. The rate of birth of people here already is slowing down. We're not getting new people moving in, and people are getting older. So this baby boom generation is getting older and living longer. So our age distribution is skewing towards the upper end where two things happen. One, the income taxes they pay go down. Two, the Social Security benefits they receive go up, and then coincident with that are their Medicare payments. So we've got this projection. It's just demographics. There's nothing complicated about it, but we can see that the spending is going up, the demands on spending, while the ability to bring in revenue is not going up. So whereas we have about a 4.5% deficit now, it'll go much higher down the road because of those twin factors. And then if interest rates actually go up, well, then, it's going to explode. I think debt in just 5 years as a share of GDP is going to be 100%, 100%, which is still not necessarily bad. Back when the European Union was creating the euro, another common currency, they needed to have pretty similar monetary policy. And one of the things was to have a debt ratio below, I think it was 120% of GDP. A lot of the countries had ratios of 150, 60, 70, because they had to bring it down.
Yeah.
So it's not unheard of to have debt that high. It just does create a burden on it. And the other worrisome trend in the U.S. Budget is that most of the growth in spending is happening in these things that we don't have any control over. So it's the mandatory spending, as I mentioned, Social Security, Medicare. That's just growing up, and you have to change the law to stop that spending. And so discretionary spending, things like on the national parks, on defense, on all those good things, that's actually not that's a smaller and smaller share of the budget. So there's not a lot of wiggle room there to say, okay, we'll just cut waste, fraud, and abuse and stop foreign aid. That's not big enough to really do very much. So.
Yeah. So I'm
gloom and doom. That's what economists are for.
I know you sent me back to the batter's box with my head down.
I know.
Now,
well, come on up, Juan Soto.
I'm coming back. As always, I hope you're enjoying the show. And also, as always, I have a favor to ask. Our ability as a nation to respond to crises like this is entirely dependent on the health of our government and the health of the political dialogue within. And we don't need Dr. Fauci to tell us the prognosis for both is dire. Now, the goal of You Don't Have to Yell is to discuss important issues free of the partisan vitriol, and we're going to be making some changes in the coming weeks to help with that one even more. But right now, I need your help. Go to your device right now, right now, and click share so everyone in your network gets a chance to take part in the conversation and hear what we're talking about here. You can also send them to YDHTY.com or to our YouTube page if they're not podcast people such as yourselves. We need more people like you who are interested in more than dumb Twitter spats between people who should be working for the good of the country. And with that, back to the show. So are there, given all the gloom and doom, given how terrible everything is going to be, is there, and I would say also, given the fact that the idea of raising taxes at this point, on the federal level at least, almost seems like an impossibility. Is there a way tax policy can be used to help solve that problem, do you feel? And if so, kind of where can we look?
There are a lot of places that we can look. I would say it's just starting with the personal income tax, that 35% is pretty low for a top marginal rate. I mean, I'm not saying go to European levels. I think in Belgium, the top marginal rate is 60%. We're not going back there, as I already said. But I think there's room at the top to tax more earned income. And again, that rate only applies to the salaries, and wages of people. And much of the top level is in unearned income. So, but I think that there's definitely room to get more from the top. And that's what happened under second President Bush and then President Obama, is that President Bush made tax cuts for everyone, and then Obama took them away for the top level. Trump gave tax cuts to everyone whoever comes next could raise them again to the top level.
Yeah.
And that would be fine. Their top rate is, even as an effective rate, is actually pretty low. So that would be good. And by the way, when I'm talking about the top level, this is like the top 1%. I mean, it's their income is $2 million and above.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if that's a lot or not very many people, but 2 million and above. So there's some room there, and we don't have an upper limit on it. So to be in the top 1%, you're at 2 million. The next level down, the 95th percent, is about 400,000.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I don't know how many people fall in there, but 400,000 is a lot lower than 2 million. So if you're just talking about the very top there, I think there is room to raise some more income in the more tax revenue in the non-income area. There are a few things, and I don't want to get too technical because it can quickly diverge into incomprehensibility.
Okay.
But in the 2017 tax bill, there was a huge giveaway to what we call pass-through companies. So they don't pay the corporate income tax, which was cut from 35 to 21%. They only pay an individual income tax rate. So people argue that corporate income is double taxed because it first pays that 21% corporate tax, and then when individuals receive a dividend, they pay an individual tax on that. So that's the double tax. A pass-through doesn't pay the corporate level tax. It's like a partnership. All the income flows through to the partners. Well, that created a huge tax break for anyone who was not in the corporate form. And it got rid of the double taxation, but it also has allowed for a lot of gimmicks and ways to have entities classified as these pass-through or partnership entities and really not pay much tax at all. And you couple that with the deferral of the capital gains tax and all, it allows people who organize their businesses in that way to really minimize their taxes. Now, Congress said that they would put what they called guardrails in place to prevent entities becoming these pass-throughs that shouldn't. But the word on the street is that the guardrails are pretty, they're not very well made.
Yeah, well, and it almost seems like the people writing the tax code can't move faster than people can figure out how to get around it. And
yeah, that's true.
And so do you have an example of like what would be a pass-through entity then?
Oh, a partnership.
Okay. And would businesses restructure specifically to take advantage of that, or would that be too onerous, would you say?
Yes, and in fact, back when the U.S. corporate rate was 35%, which it was, I believe, from 93 until the 2017 Act. So there's a lot of incentive for companies to reform as either partnerships or S corporations, which is a technical term for these smaller partnerships. And so as a share of business income, I don't know the exact numbers, but let's say if it had been 70% corporate, 30% pass through, it flipped. So it was a huge tax incentive. I mean, there's people like to minimize their taxes, and back in the day, the tax center was just seen as sort of backwater. Now the tax department at a big company can be seen as a profit center, trying to minimize taxes. So anyway, so to go back to the comment about, well, what would be good taxes? There's a phrase that I learned way back when I first started graduate school, when I took my tax class, which was, it's attributed to Huey Long in Louisiana. Don't tax you, don't tax me, tax the man behind the tree. So the best kind of taxes are the ones that people think someone else is paying. So, for example, while theoretical economists would do all sorts of stuff about tax incidents and who really bears the burden of a tax and how does it get shifted and all, people love the corporate income tax because it looks like someone else is paying it. So even though it may in the wash end up that the company actually reduces wages to cover the tax. So those are good kinds of taxes. The other kinds of good taxes are things that tax stuff that we don't want people to be doing. There's tons of evidence that the tax on tobacco has cut back on smoking. So that's a good thing. The federal government hasn't raised the tax on gas. It's like 18 cents a gallon since about 1993. There's no reason for that because we drive a lot and it wrecks the roads. And why shouldn't the people driving these cars pay some sort of fuel tax? And granted, there are state taxes on top of it, so it's more than 18 in total, but that's something that should be raised. I think that carbon taxes should be something that we tax. In Europe, you asked me about that. Europe has a ton of taxes on transportation rate related activities. And, it has a twofold benefit. It gets people to stop driving in private cars and trucks so much. It puts it in public transport. And it also helps the environment. Now, they don't do it perfectly because the tax on diesel is lower than the tax on regular gas, and diesel is more polluting than regular gas. But they're sort of going along it in the right way by having a range of taxes that are trying to deal with carbon emissions. Yeah. And the U.S. hasn't really had much in the carbon area. We've got a few places with cap and trade, a few regions that are trying to control pollution that way. But Europe has a whole cap and trade system Euro-wide where actually the permits to trade are bought and sold all the time, just like a stock on Wall Street. It works great.
Yeah, and that was actually the interesting thing I always found about Europe is that is the way they tax consumption. And I remember, this is a few years back, I was in Sweden and I was at the hotel bar and I ordered a couple drinks. And when I got my bill, I think it was 3 drinks total, and it ended up coming out to $75. And at first, I thought $75 for a drink. I was a little put off by it. And then I thought, yeah, but if I needed an appendectomy, it wouldn't cost me anything. So in a way, maybe I'll take the more expensive whiskey and the less expensive appendectomy. I feel like just, you like that logic. I feel like Europe does a better job overall taxing consumption than we do.
Okay. So basically, would you rather have the choice between an appendectomy or a free or a drink?
Yes.
And you're saying, well, I want someone else to choose for me. So if I'm in Europe, they've chosen to give me a free appendectomy, but they're going to charge me for my drink. In the U.S., they say you choose what you want to do. If you want to buy the drink, okay, but then you're not getting a free appendectomy. You're not getting your appendix out for free. So one of the things is that if you, and I don't want to delve into your personal 1040 because you're going to be filing it in a month or so, but if you were to imagine that, let's put the United States system, just transfer it all over to the Europe system and say, okay, everyone, I'm the planner, and I'm going to decide that we need to provide these things to all of our citizens. And I'm framing it this way because, in fact, that is sort of what's happening in the current presidential election. Is that one side wants to say, let's have the government provide these things, and the other says, no, let's keep taxes low and let people choose. So if you were to take the U.S. system and say, okay, let's plop you all in Europe, and why don't we choose Denmark? Because we know a lot about Denmark. So if you were to do that, you would, Americans, the typical American, the Dan American,
yes,
would go from paying roughly 16% of income overall in taxes. That's what the federal government collects as a share of GDP. 16% in the U.S. this past year. It would go to, in Denmark, 48, 3 times as high. Now you say, oh, but wait a minute, you've only told half the story. That's the tax. If I'm going to move to this system, you better give me the transfer. That's what we call it in technical terms. You tax and transfer. So you'd say, okay, but now that the government has all that money, so I'm no longer buying my own private insurance at $25,000 a year, which might be what a typical premium is for a family of 6 like yours. I don't know. So you say, but that's not going out the door anymore. I'm not buying it. I'm going to get it now from the government. So when I go to the hospital, I get whatever I want. You'd have to convince people that is actually going to happen. That the taxes the higher taxes you're now paying actually go towards things you want. And that's where the complications arise. Because I started asking people, tell me, what's your favorite tax?
Yeah.
What's your least favorite tax? And they're looking at me like, are you crazy? You think I have a favorite tax? Yeah. And I said, okay, well, let's rephrase it. What's your least favorite? Anyway, so so most people, really don't mind paying taxes, but they would say, but I want to make sure it goes to things I like. So what I really don't like about my taxes is that I don't want the government to spend it on defense. And someone might say, look, I gave up to put my kids through school. And now you're saying that I should forgive, this is a little bit off topic, but forgive the debt of people who didn't save and borrowed? What about the life of giving up that I did, the sacrifices I made in those people who didn't? So, and then to say, like on the healthcare, well, if you get something for nothing, it's probably worth that. And so there's a real problem with insurance. And again, I'll give the technical term, but then let it drop. Because the whole problem with moral hazard is that if you know you're going to get reimbursed for something, you don't care if you lose it, whether it's because your kids know that you and your wife are going to come pick them up if they crash their car, or if you know that you've got car insurance, and so if you get in an accident, you don't have to be quite as careful. I mean, it's a strange thing, because you'd say, well, who would want their house to burn down? But you can say, if I know I'm going to be completely reimbursed and made whole again, you're going to be less careful. So one of the problems with having the system I'm arguing in Denmark is that you get this kind of stuff where people might not be quite as careful. By the way, I gave birth to a kid in Belgium and here in DC. I also had knee surgery in Belgium and in DC. So I've used both systems. I worked in Belgium at the university. I work here. There's no doubt that the out-of-pocket expenses were much lower in Belgium than here. No doubt. But I only lived there for 7 years and only paid in the system for that long. So how does Europe do it? I don't know. I think it's partly of what you're used to. Like I said, we would never in the U.S. go back to a top marginal rate of 70%. Never. We've been too low for too long. So part of the problem of going to a Europe-style thing is that it'd be very difficult to convince Americans that I'll be willing to give you raise my taxes, and you are going to promise government to give it back. Now, there's a way that we can look at to see to what extent that happens in governments. There's something called the Gini coefficient, Gini, and it goes from 0 to 1. If the Gini coefficient is 1, it means one person has all the income in the economy.
Okay.
If it's that's how it's easy to remember. Yeah. If it's 0, then everyone has the same share.
Yeah.
So people measure this, and it's a good measure because you can sort of agree on how it's measured around the world. So a lot of countries do have very high Gini coefficients because there's great income inequality in some developing countries. But by way of comparison, you can look at how unequal is income at the market level before you've done any taxes and transferring. Because in our progressive income tax system, we tax the rich to give to the poor. So you're doing some redistribution. So in the U.S., before we do any of that, our Gini coefficient, and I got this from the CBO, is about 0.52. That's about halfway there.
Okay.
In Europe, in the EU, and I'm only talking about the EU when I say Europe, it's from 0.36 to 0.46. So some places it's much lower, some places it approaches it. Then you say, okay, so it's unequal. Now let's make all these transfers that we're talking about. Let's tax people, and then let's give them free stuff. Your appendix is out for free, and in exchange, you've paid high taxes. So the U.S. does that. We transfer a lot to people at the low income level, and in fact, the least well-off people end up getting tax refunds. They don't pay any taxes, and because their net benefits are higher than the taxes they might pay. So the U.S. gets its Gini coefficient down to about 0.44 from all that. So it's pretty good. Europeans get it down to about 0.23, 2.3. Much bigger transfer happening.
Yeah.
So the problem, I think, with going to a system where you'd say, I'd love to get my appendix out for free, is that you're taking the risk that you've paid for something and the government may decide to take it back.
Yes.
So they decide, we're not really getting as much revenue as we thought we would, so we're only going to pay for half of your appendix. And you say, but wait a minute, I got to get the whole thing out. Don't leave half in there. And that I think is one of the real problems. And it's actually one of the things with the Social Security system. That is not a means-tested system. No matter how well off you are, you get your Social Security benefits. Now, part of the benefits will be taxed, but one reason that the government tends to keep benefits as promised is because everyone says, you promised that when I paid my payroll taxes when working, that you would pay me my pension when I retired. Mm-hmm. And if the U.S. breaks that contract with Social Security and Social Security becomes a means-tested program, well, then it goes into all those other programs where people say, you're paying people not to work, or, why do these undeserving people get it? So Social Security holds because of that promise that the government so far, it's scaled back on some things, but it has not broken the promise of getting Social Security.
Yeah. And that was my big issue with the European approach to tax and government financing, which is that those costs still exist. And even though the out-of-pocket cost for your average citizen might be minimal, they're kind of buried in this budget. And I do think, and I'll ask for your opinion as an economist on this, I do feel like there is some benefit to structures being tested by demand and by just ability to pay. And a great example is education, where the cost of university the cost of education on the whole is growing. And even though it may be buried somewhere in the budgets of Ireland and France and Belgium and so on, it still exists. It is still eating up more of that budget. Whereas in the US, it seems that model is being tested a little harder because everybody here kind of bears the cost outright. And so, does that? Am I making sense there, or does that resonate at all? Or
you do make sense. Yeah. You're making sense. You're back on.
All right.
So on the education front, yes, the cost of the education is, there are a lot of free places in Europe, and I taught at it's called the Free University of Brussels, the ULB. In French, but it was free of religion, not free. Oh. That's why it was a counterpoint to the Catholic University.
Got it. Okay.
But yeah, it's much less expensive. That said, a lot of people, when they want to get the best education, want to go elsewhere. So that's not necessarily dollar related. What I think is actually the bigger problem, and if I could divert government spending anywhere, I would divert it to education. I would say that is the best way to give people the tools to get ahead in life. That education. And it's got to start at a young age, like preschool. There's clear evidence that has a big ROI, return on investment. So when I went to the University of California, Berkeley, fees were very low. In fact, I was out of state the first year, and then I became in-state. Fees were very low and very affordable. And I've talked to my classmates and said, did you worry about paying for college? No, my parents weren't worried. They could pay for all of us. There's not a single person now who says that about their children who are still in California. And so part of what happened in California, and it's a story told across the United States, but in California, because I was there, I recall it, property taxes had gotten really high. So they passed a property tax limitation known as Prop 13. And that was really the beginning of the tax revolt, about 1978. So you recall Reagan from California got elected in 1980, coming out of that atmosphere. So ever since these tax limits were put in place, states have had to figure out how to fund things. And between the limit on property tax revenues, and there was a legitimate reason for it, because grandma had a nice little bungalow on Newport Beach where she could no longer afford her property taxes because the value of the house had gone up so much. I would argue that there were better ways to limit that than to put a blanket restriction on it, but that's not what happened. And then the other thing that happened in California was this: get tough on crime, spend more money on the criminal system, criminal justice, also build more prisons. And 3 strikes and you're out, you're in prison for a really, 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 really long time. And sadly, a few years ago, California started spending more on prisons than on education. Now, there are a lot of explanations for that. A lot of the 3 strikes you're out were, shoplifting and things like that. It's hard to go back and put that back in the bottle. But again, the taking away money from education means that people are saying, I don't want my taxes to go to these kinds of things. If they could go to education, it would. okay, let me give a charitable contribution to my alma mater. And that's a tax incentive. So if I were to say, let's make it more favorable for tax breaks for things we want people to do. So let's give a charitable contribution. Now, there's other issues involved with that, but let's encourage behavior by giving a tax break. Let's discourage behavior by raising taxes. So cut the price for education, raise the price for driving your Hummer.
Okay.
And those are the kinds of changes that I would make. So, there's this. You're a former comedian, stand-up comedian. So There's a joke I like to say about taxes.
Okay.
Is that there are two people who don't like paying taxes. Two kinds of people: men and women.
Now, the weirdest thing about going back and listening to this recording was me talking about how 3 of my kids were homesick with a fever. And I actually had this the month before, and I'm starting to think that we actually had the Rona in the Sally house. And if you want a taste for what I sounded like when I was in the middle of this mystery illness, give episode 28 a listen and let me know what you think, because I legit think I had this thing for like a month. Now, getting back to the episode. While the relationship between taxes and economic growth is foggy, I think the real question seems to be, what are the things we want government to be doing for us? Because we're all comfortable with a socialized military, free healthcare for the elderly, and a socialized highway system. Yet some of the services certain folks would deem essential, like healthcare, are fiercely debated. And I'm not going to wade into any specific policy debate, but I am going to put out a theory, and I want your thoughts on this. Part of the function of government is to ensure that people don't become victims of circumstance, which is why we fund a military, police force, fire department, and education for all citizens. And I think when we look to expand the role of government, we should be asking if it serves this purpose. And that can apply to any number of policies we talk about now. I'd love to get your thoughts, so please come visit me on YDHTY.com or find You Don't Have to Yell on Twitter or Facebook and let me know what you think. As always, music courtesy of Quellertac. YDHTY is produced by the Big Gino, Jason Putney. Until the next, this is Dan Sally, signing off.